Arguments are part of human nature. Sometimes this means bickering with a friend on where to go out to dinner, and sometimes this can mean something like discussing the best way to reduce drug addiction in a community. Arguments can vary from a lot of different things. Arguments aren't always emotional fits of anger over whoever ate the last piece of cake. In fact, they're actually pretty important. Arguments can lead to political decisions like going to war or funding important programs that people depend on to live. Arguments are a healthy way to discuss the logic behind your beliefs and share your ideas with others. Sometimes this may persuade them onto your side, and sometimes, even if that's not the case, if you construct a strong enough logical argument, you may sway them to a compromise. Looking at the importance of arguments, it would make sense that everyone would want to learn to construct a good one. One of the best ways to make sure that you're presenting a good argument is avoiding these things called logical fallacies. A logical fallacy is a line of reasoning that's invalid. So that means that there's something wrong with the logic that you're presenting. It's really important to be able to recognize logical fallacies, not only because it'll help you become a better debater, but because it can help you look at other people's arguments to decide whether they're being logical or not. This video is going to introduce the most commonly used logical fallacies in arguments. Being aware of these will help you in argumentative essays and even some arguments in your own life. One common logical fallacy is called the argument from ignorance. And this usually refers to someone saying that something is most likely true just because it hasn't been disproved. Just because you can't disprove something doesn't mean that it does exist. For example, if someone were to say that Bigfoot existed just because he hasn't been disproven, it doesn't really necessarily mean that at all. A really common logical fallacy is called begging the question or circular thinking, and in this logical fallacy, usually that means that you're repeating the same argument over and over again without really supporting anything. An example of circular thinking would be if you were to say free college is bad, and pretty much not supporting it and just saying free college is bad because it's free college, and it'd be really bad if it's free. And in that example, it's pretty obvious that it's circular thinking, but sometimes people don't notice that they're not providing support for what they're trying to claim. So when you're going back and looking at your essay, make sure that when you make claims, you're not just repeating the same thing over and over again, and you are providing some legitimate analysis and support for what you're trying to say. Another really dangerous logical fallacy is dogmatism, where you completely ignore the other side's argument and don't even consider it. And there's actually a lot of problems with this line of thinking. First of all, without looking at the other side's argument, you're not going to be able to really think about how to persuade them onto your side. They may disagree with you for reasons that you haven't even considered, and there might actually be some really reasonable compromises in that. Additionally, sometimes even if someone disagrees with you, they do have valid reasons for believing in what they believe in. And if you completely ignore that, you can miss out on some really good information that you could learn. For example, let's say that there's this new medical plan that everyone's arguing about, and you're on the side of wanting to support it. If you completely ignore the reason that the other side doesn't want the medical plan, you're not going to really be able to argue anything. Now, on the other hand, if you find out that they're worried about higher taxes, and you find out that they'd be actually saving money through it, and you explain that to them, you can actually more effectively bring them over to your side. If you completely ignore the fact that they're worried about their finances and money, you wouldn't really get to that conclusion. Another logical fallacy is called the hasty generalization. And this logical fallacy is basically where you take one small example of something and act as if it represents a really big group or phenomenon that it doesn't quite necessarily. This line of thinking usually refers to absolutely no statistics, and that's where the biggest problem from it comes. An example of this would be if you had a neighbor and they somehow had free college and they didn't appreciate it. So therefore, you said that nobody would appreciate free college and everyone would go and disrupt classrooms because they didn't care. The problem with this thinking is there's absolutely no statistics to back this, and there's no proof. There is just one small sample size who did one thing, when in reality there may be many students who would appreciate free college. Another dangerous logical fallacy is black and white thinking, and it's basically where you have this either or mentality and you make this big assumption that someone's either completely for something or completely against it on the opposite spectrum. So, for example, if you're trying to argue that students should have homework in elementary school, and you say, you either support giving students homework or you want them to completely fail and never learn anything and be illiterate. And that's a really big assumption to make. People on the other spectrum don't necessarily believe that. Some just believe that students shouldn't have homework. And just because they don't believe in giving students homework doesn't mean that they believe that they should never learn anything at all. And that's where the really big logical fallacy comes in. Additionally, there's people who are actually in the middle. Some people might not be completely for homework or against it. They might actually be in the middle where they're saying we should reduce homework but keep it in schools. Another logical fallacy to avoid is called slippery slope, where you basically kind of start off with one thing and have it snowball into a really big assumption. An example of this would be if you were to say that we should keep sports in school because if we were to take them out, students would not get enough exercise, which would be a fair enough assessment, but then you went further to say, and then the no exercise would cause obesity, which would cause heart problems, and then students would start dying, and that's just such a big catastrophic assumption to make, and you should really avoid doing that in any sense. Another logical fallacy to avoid is called a non sequitur, and that basically translates to it does not follow. So this is where you basically have one thing and then make an assumption that doesn't quite fit. And there's a lot of different types of logical fallacies that can actually fit into this, with slippery slope being one of them. But an example of this would be if you were to say, if you love your children, you should give them homework. Those two things don't necessarily correlate. They don't follow each other. Another example would be if someone were to say that they liked ice cream, but they weren't a big fan of cheese, and you said, cheese is made of milk, ice cream's made of milk, so you should have to like cheese. And that doesn't necessarily mean that at all. Just because they're both made out of milk doesn't mean that liking ice cream correlates with liking cheese. So this is just an introduction to some of the most common logical fallacies. Hopefully being able to look at these gives you an idea of when you're using them and how to best construct your arguments. There's a lot of different logical fallacies out there, so if you're interested, you can always do extra research to find out all the different kinds. The thing to take out of this the most is to always double check your arguments and make sure that you're using real support and not making the other side seem so demonized that you can't understand what they're thinking. Because whether you believe in a certain thing or not, that's based on opinion, and in order to support your opinion, you're going to need facts and logic. Hopefully this video helps you learn some logical fallacies that you can use for both argumentative writing and your own personal life.